We will now move on to our final and most interesting academic session of the day on women's imaging. I invite on stage our esteemed chairpersons, Dr. Rupa Ranganathan, Lead Consultant, Breast and Women's Imaging, Kovai Medical Center and Hospitals, Dr. Subhashri, Head of Radiology, ESI Hospital, and Dr. Bhavna Dev, Senior Consultant, Sri Ramachandra University, Chennai. We welcome you all, ma'am. First up, here to speak about optimizing MRI protocols in gynecological malignancies, I welcome on stage an international expert, Dr. Atul Shinagre.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here today and thanks for the invitation. So in this lecture, I'm going to talk about optimizing the MRI protocol in gynecological malignancies. I have no relevant conflicts of interest, but I do have a disclosure. I'm not a physicist. I'm not MRI physics expert. I'm a clinical radiologist. I do work with our MRI experts and our MRI clinical service chief to optimize the protocols, but my focus remains on clinical imaging, so that's what I'm going to talk about. So outline is very simple. I'm going to talk about the why we should optimize and standardize. Then we'll focus on the protocol for uterus and for ovaries. So first question, why should we standardize? So first, the role of imaging in imaging of gyn cancers, diagnosis and staging is growing. We know that the 2018 FIGO staging for cervical cancer staging, it formally includes imaging. Imaging also influences staging and management of other cancers. And so there's more to high quality report than just making correct diagnosis. And standardization across various scanning sites is key to improving the report quality. So, but standardizing the imaging protocols or optimizing them requires coordinated team-based efforts. And if you really want to improve the quality, it just goes beyond just giving the correct diagnosis. We want to start with scanning protocols. If we have good protocols, we have good quality imaging, then we can create good quality content by, say, following some kind of report template or by standardizing it. We need to standardize the report language. That's why we had different RADs and lexicons. And finally, we need to add the component of diagnostic confidence or diagnostic certainty. How confident you are about the diagnosis is really important because that changes the approach from the referrer and the patient. So let me start with an example that's outside of gyn imaging. This patient had metastatic RCC who was on clinical trial, and the baseline scan was done. We have multiple scanning centers, so it was done at one of the centers that only does portal venous phase imaging. And on that, the liver was normal. Patient was doing fine, came back after 3 months, and went to a different site that performed arterial and portal venous phase. And the portal venous phase was again normal, the liver was normal, but on arterial phase, we see these multiple lesions. Now we know that RCC has hypervascular metastasis. We can see them on arterial phase, and sometimes they are isoattenuating with the surrounding liver on portal venous phase. Still, this was a new finding, and by clinical trial, this would be called progression. Plus, the patient was worried, thinking that there is a new disease. So this confusion was solely created because imaging protocols were variable. And this is not good quality care. So basically, we had few examples like this. So we spent 2 or 3 years to optimize protocols and harmonize protocols across all of our sites, all the hospitals. We have 13 hospitals, 60 magnets, more than that, CT scanners. It took us a long time to harmonize the protocols across all the sites, but it's important. So that's why we should have some kind of standardization and optimization. So with that background, let's move on to uterine protocol. So one thing to keep in mind, uterus is not oriented vertically or horizontally, it's oriented obliquely. and that orientation changes between patients and within the same patient. So we have to keep that in mind anytime we scan uterus. The most common protocol that we use is for endometrial cancer and for cervical cancer. We use the same protocol for scanning of the vagina or vulvar cancer, but those are uncommon, so I'm going to focus on these two only, and basically it's the same protocol. So the core elements of this protocol are T2-weighted imaging, diffusion, and T1, without and with contrast. It's really very simple. So let's start with T2-weighted imaging. T2 without FAT-SAT is our core sequence for anatomic evaluation. That's where most of the evaluation starts and it is focused on. And so high resolution, small FOV T2 is important. Now we need to add true axial or coronals. That means those are oblique sequences. Those are really important for evaluation of uterus. And the exact plane depends on the site of interest. If you want to, for example, if you want to scan the endometrium, you need to align it with the plane of the uterus. If you want to scan for cervical cancer, you need to align it with the plane of cervix. If you are interested in vagina, this patient had hysterectomy and there was interest in looking at vaginal wall recurrence, you need to align the plane with the vagina. And this is where creating these oblique sequences need radiologist input, because many of the scans the technologists can do on their own, but this is where radiologist input and oversight is important. So this is an example of true axial and true coronal. So they are not oriented like this and like this. They are oriented along the uterus. So axial to the uterine, in this case cervix, and coronal to the uterus. So this is important. Now what might happen if you just scan regular plain axials? We might end up over or underestimating degree of invasion, or like the assessment will not be accurate. This patient actually had very subtle thinning of the muscular layer, and that would not be seen on regular axial plane. It was only seen on true axials. This was another example shared by one of my friends, Stephanie Nougare. She practices in France. And again, same thing. In this case, it's the other way around. Earlier case, invasion would have been missed. In this case, actually, there was no invasion, but if you get simple axial, it looked like there's invasion. So this was overestimating the extent of the disease. That's why it's important to get these true or oblique plane images. Next sequence is diffusion. We need high B-value or DWI images. This is the functional component to anatomic imaging. We of course also need multi-B value diffusion so that we can get ADC images as well. And this improves the tumor conspicuity, assessment of invasion, lymph node assessment, and distant metastasis. And creating fused images between T2 and DWI images, that's also very helpful. I mean, our assessment focuses on the T2 and diffusion weighted images, but these images are really good when for the referrals. And sometimes they just bring out some of the details. Those are not very easy to see. This is just another example. Now here this patient had cervical cancer. Now, not so much on post-contrast, but on T2 you see this kind of ill-defined, like soft tissue-like appearance. It's unclear exactly what that is. You don't really see it very well on post-contrast images. But on diffusion, there was this kind of restricting soft tissue. On fused images, you could see it very well, and ended up infiltrating soft tissue. So sometimes it just brings out some details. Another example, the extent of invasion is hard to assess on these images, but diffusion adds to that assessment. Now, early detection of lymph nodes is also helpful with diffusion-weighted images. Now, diffusion brings out the lymph nodes. It shows them very well. Sometimes they say it's poor man's pet. That does not mean the lymph nodes that stand out on diffusion are positive, because diffusion just makes lymph nodes stand out. That, again, it does not say those are positive lymph nodes. We have to assess them based on their size, morphology, including whether they are round, is the margin irregular, are they heterogeneous? We have to assess them. But still, diffusion just shows them. Even tiny lymph nodes become prominent, and it catches your eye, and it becomes it draws your attention, it becomes easy to assess them. Now, next sequence is T1. We need multi-phase post-contrast imaging, again in oblique planes, for accurate assessment of invasion. Now, in this case, there was extensive disease all over the place, including invasion around the urethra, that just, like, you see it on T2-weighted images, but you can also confirm it on post-contrast. Now, what's the important time? 90 to 120 seconds after contrast injection is ideal for assessment of myometrial invasion depth. And that's when we see maximum contrast between the endometrial cancer and myometrium. If you scan it too early, sometimes it's not very easy to assess. It's like in this case, see here, it's a little bit hard to assess, but later, 90 seconds, it's a little bit, the contrast is better. Now, small FOV images are great for local staging, but we need like a little bit wider FOV for assessment of lymph nodes and or hydronephrosis. So sometimes we also get this big field of view T2 coronal single sequence that shows us retroperitoneal lymph nodes, hydronephrosis, and some other findings. Now, next thing to sort of keep in mind is motion artifacts. Giving antiperistaltic agents like glucagon to reduce motion artifacts is important because sometimes otherwise the image quality can be quite inferior. Now, the practical problem with that is as especially the larger hospital systems have multiple scanning centers. And so keeping that oversight or having somebody to inject it becomes a little bit tricky. So we struggle with that logistically. But having the ability to give antiperistaltic agents is I think, really important. Uterine contractions can sometimes mimic either endometrial or myometrial abnormality. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's ideal to have moderately full bladder. We don't want it over distended for sure, but having like a little bit bladder distension is helpful. So that was about the uterine protocol. Now let's talk about the ovary. So this is where we follow the ORAD's recommended protocol. So again, the core elements are the same and with some additions. So we need T2-weighted images, diffusion, we need in and out of phase or chemical shift imaging, and we'll talk about why. And then we need T1 without and with contrast, and here the additional element is dynamic contrast enhancement or DCE. It's not absolutely required, but recommended. So this is our ORAD's protocol. We use, like I said, T2, in and out of phase images, diffusion, dynamic contrast enhancement with temporal resolution less than 15 seconds. If you can't do that, then you do regular non-dynamic T1 post with focus on 30 to 40 second images, because that's where you want to assess the enhancement. And if possible, go for like slightly thinner slices that improves the assessment. So this is an example, again, T2 without fat sat. It's our core sequence for anatomic evaluation. Again, just like the earlier protocol, having high resolution, small FOV is important. And we need 3 or at least 2 orthogonal planes, but we try to do it in 3 planes. So that gives like optimal assessment. Diffusion weighted images, again, high B value DWI and ADC is important. We don't want to assess diffusion weighted images without ADC, obviously. It adds the functional component to anatomic imaging, and especially with ORAD's MRI protocol, it's helpful or important for detecting lesions like fibroma, fibrothecoma, fibrous tumors, because if it is dark on T2 and dark on diffusion, that is not diffusion restricting, then we know it's ORAD's 2 or fibroma. The next sequence is in and out of phase images. So it's okay, this is important for assessment of fat. Now, for macroscopic fat, doing simply T1 and T1 fat sat is enough. But we know that dermoids can have both macroscopic or microscopic fat. And for microscopic fat, we need chemical shift imaging. Like in this case, now on T2, it just looks like basically just multilocular cystic lesion. But we still don't know what the content is. Is it fluid? Is it something else? On in and out of phase images, the entire lesion suppresses because all of this was microscopic fat. So that's why in and out of phase images are helpful. And then obviously we need the T1, pre and post contrast. This is important for assessment of solid tissue. Now, what does solid tissue mean? It's basically solid component that enhances, and it can take the form of papillary projections, mural nodules, irregular walls of septations, or solid portion. There could be other solid components that do not count as solid tissue. That means smooth walls of septations, or clot or debris, or fat, or Rokitansky nodule in a dermoid. That does not count as solid tissue. And then when we say solid lesion, that means at least 80% of that lesion is solid tissue. That's a solid lesion. And anytime you see solid tissue in a lesion, the enhancement characteristic drives the ORAD's classification, unless you think it's fibroma or fibrothecoma. Now, let's look at enhancement patterns. With dynamic contrast enhancement, we have the luxury of creating these time intensity curves. They are of three types. The low risk curve is basically minimal gradual enhancement without any shoulder, without any plateau. That's low risk curve, ORADS 3. Then it can be intermediate risk curve. That is ORADS 4, that has moderate upslope, there's a shoulder and a plateau. And then there is high risk curve, or ORADS 5. That is sharp upslope, more than myometrium, more than outer myometrium, if you can place ROI right there. And then there's a shoulder and plateau. So what does it look like in practice? So this is a low risk curve. You see this white line, which is gradual, slow increase. That's low risk curve. Then intermediate risk, there is upslope, there's a shoulder, there's a plateau, but it's less than myometrium. And then high risk curve, this is white line, sudden upslope, shoulder and plateau, but this is more than myometrium. So this is high risk, ORADS 5. Now, if you don't have DCE, then you can rely on non-dynamic or conventional enhancement patterns. You assess it at 30 to 40 seconds. And if it's equal or less than myometrium, you call it ORADS 4. If it is more than myometrium, you call it ORADS 5. Now, this means you cannot distinguish between ORADS 3 and ORADS 4. That's a limitation. So let's look at this example. We see this T2 sort of heterogeneously hypo to iso-intense lesion or mass, but there are some areas which are T2 hyperintense. It does show enhancement. So that is something to keep in mind. Now, in this case, we did not have dynamic contrast enhancement, but next thing to look at is diffusion. This is not T2 dark, diffusion dark. So this is not a typical fibroma, but at the same time, the enhancement is less than myometrium. So this was called ORADS 3, low risk. Non-pathology, any guesses? So on pathology, this ended up being cellular fibroma. Typically, fibromas are dark on T2 and diffusion, but in this case, cellular fibromas can have this appearance of slightly sort of intermediate T2 signal. They sometimes even enhance quite avidly. They can show restricted diffusion. So they can be a little bit challenging to assess on imaging. So now let's use one last case to sort of put it together. Now this patient has this lesion. On T2, there is this high T2 signal component, and then there is this relatively intermediate T2 signal component. There is very subtle enhancement. The lesion itself was not very large. It was maybe 2 to 3 centimeters in size, and subtle enhancement. But then on diffusion and ADC, you know it's diffusion restricting. So there is solid tissue. It's intermediate T2 signal enhances. It is solid tissue. It shows restricted diffusion. And then on SAG, we also see, even on subtraction, we see some area that is enhancing. So based on this, the assessment would be ORADS 4. That means there's 50% risk of malignancy. But then we had dynamic contrast enhancement here, and that curve was low risk curve. So if you did not have that, the assessment would have been ORADS 4, but now we know this is low risk curve. The assessment was ORADS 3. We reduced the risk from, like our interpreted risk from 50% to 5%. But then we also had in and out of phase images, and there was signal drop. So there's microscopic fat. So now our risk dropped to 0.5%, ORADS 2. So essentially, just by using the correct protocol, we would have called ORADS 4, patient would have gone to surgery. Instead of that, we avoided the surgery, called this ORADS 2, this was just a dermoid, and the risk was like 0.5%. So something to keep in mind, just by having the correct protocol, you can give correct risk stratification. So in summary, optimized, standardized protocols are important for high quality imaging. We need to include the core elements that are T2, diffusion, and T1 with pre and post contrast for uterine protocol, and for ovary, we add the in and out of phase images and dynamic contrast enhancement. We need to optimize for specific needs and scanner, and that leads to sort of improved diagnosis and staging and plays a central role in patient management. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your valuable insights. Your talk on optimizing MRI protocols has provided us with concrete strategies to improve our practice. Next, we have a very relevant topic, carcinoma endometrium, current update by Dr. Palak, Professor and in charge breast imaging and interventions, Tata Memorial Hospital. We welcome you on stage.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Shingare. That was really a nice session, and that makes my job easier. So, I've been asked to talk on updates of endometrial cancer. So I would just like to begin with one sentence. My life was happier with the earlier staging of endometrial cancer versus what it is now. And I think a lot of us would echo with it. So just going ahead with it. There have been paradigm changes in the staging, which was really called for because of prognostication, which is the key to any reason for stratification for imaging, is based on staging, not just staging, but also molecular profiling. What is the classification of endometrial cancers? So we have endometrioid types and serous and clear cell. So there are, like in breast cancer, in gynecological cancers and endometrial cancers, we have something called as good biology tumors, where we can actually preserve the uterus and fertility sparing treatments can be offered, whereas you can have the bad biology tumors. So coming to that as a broad classification, the low grade endometrioid cancers, which are essentially coming from an increased estrogenic phase, are the better biology tumors compared to the others. So which are the ones which are not so good are the high-grade endometrioid or the serous or the clear cell. So the prognostication essentially depends on multiple factors, which is the stage, the depth of endometrial myometrial invasion, lymphovascular invasion, nodal status, and histologic grade. So when it comes to imaging, stage and the depth of myometrial invasion is what is essentially in our pocket, and I think we can control that pretty well. This was the earlier, happier staging that I would say, because our job was very simple. If I have to say what is stage 1, A versus B, I did not even have to think whether there is minimal myometrial invasion present or absent. It was a very clear stage 1A, stage 1B, and we now see that the dot represents we have an addition out here. Similarly, in stage 2, there was just a T2, and then stage 3, essentially 3 parts of it, and 4 again has 3 parts now. So let us move on to the updates. Now, the latest NCCN guidelines version 3 of 2025, based on the updates that are there reflecting FIGO staging, suggests that MRI is perhaps the best modality for earlier staging and loco-regional extent for endometrial cancers. If it is not available, or if a patient cannot afford an MRI or cannot get an MRI done for any reason, then transvaginal ultrasound is the second best option. However, we can keep debating, both are equally good and really depends on the sources. I would just take a moment here. Acquisition is equally important. A very horribly done and a horribly planned MRI would be far worse than a very well performed transvaginal ultrasound. So just as we've learned that planning and acquisition is so important, it is an equal pillar for your diagnostics. Protocol has been well covered, so I will not dwell into it. So I often say that the uterus does yoga in the body, and it can anti-flex and anti-vert to whatever extent it wants, and that's precisely where you need to train your whoever is sitting at the console to have a look at it and plan very well and very accurately. So just to show an endometrioid carcinoma on ultrasound, we have this solid looking mass with very minimal vascularity. This was a low grade tumor. We've seen these images on T1, dark on it, T2 it is kind of bright or hyper. Restricted diffusion significantly, it's going right up to the serosa, and okay, so this is a tumor, there's no rocket science in it. Coming to another tumor, which is a high grade and the more not a grade tumor, which is the clear cell carcinoma, similar T1, similar T2, and similar restricted diffusion profiling. So what I'm trying to say is, we are not very good in predicting the biology of whether it is a low grade or a high grade with good enough accuracy, I would say, and we need more literature on that. So our job is essentially confined to identifying the loco-regional extent and staging. Contrast kinetics, again, very well covered. So the normal myometrium enhances much more and much faster than the endometrial tumors. And between the endometrial and cervical, sometimes you can have greater perfusion in endometrial cancers than cervical cancer. So to remember the time points of these uptakes of contrast can help in differentiating them. So coming to the revised FIGO 2023 staging, We have stage 1A. One has a ABC. Let me make it simpler. Stage 2 also has an ABC. Stage 3 also has an ABC, and 4 also has an ABC. All right, so that's at least one take-home message you'll remember. I will try to make it a little simpler for you. This is a nice article which many of us have put up together to understand the reason of does MRI have a role? Because when the FIGO 23 announced the new staging, all of us are like, why do we even do an MRI? You know, like we literally have no role. Well, it's not that. We surely have a lot of role. So these are just my sketches where I would say whatever is not aggressive is NA, and LG is low grade, and the red fellow is aggressive. So let me take you to some sketches so this is easier to understand. So 1A1 tumor is a non-aggressive tumor which is confined to the endometrium. Then we have 1A2, which is less than 50% invasion of the myometrium, and it is non-aggressive. 1B, when it will be a non-aggressive tumor that is extending beyond 50%. So this is explainable. But the moment you come to an aggressive tumor, even if it is confined to the endometrium, it becomes a stage 1C. So the prognostication really depends on what the biology and histology is. And then we have something called as 1A3, where there may be endometrial confined disease and tumor also in the ovary. So these are essentially the low grade or the intermediate grade endometrial tumors, and that would be 1A3. So looking at our job on MRI is then to see confinement. So here we see a tumor. The uterus is seen here, the tumor is well seen. What am I seeing is there is a continuity of the inner junctional zone. Okay, so this is the inner myometrium or the darker junctional zone. The tumor is well delineated, that is the posterior wall, this is the anterior wall. On the diffusion, there is significant restricted diffusion. I'm not very sure whether it is going and involving up to the outer myometrium or not. So we need a multi-parametric approach, especially for endometrium. So we have more literature coming in when we talk of cervical cancers, that we can have a biparametric imaging, but for endometrial cancers, I feel a contrast plays a significant role. So here on the post-contrast imaging, we have the intensely enhancing myometrium versus the poor enhancing endometrial cancer out there. What about this lesion? So here we have a distended one. So can we say this involves more than half the myometrium? Maybe yes, maybe not. So on the T2 weighted image, although I am seeing a compressed junctional zone, but maybe it's compressed or is it involved? This is the post-contrast imaging where again the tumor is enhancing lesser than the myometrium. When we look at the dynamic post-contrast imaging, so if you're using a post-contrast, try to acquire a dynamic post-contrast imaging. So what am I seeing here? This is a subendometrial enhancement. A subendometrial enhancement is the earliest enhancement that is seen in the uterine body, and essentially that is usually intact in about 60 to 70% of normal women. So when is it absent? If there are large fibroids, or there is adenomyosis or hyperplasia, so or with atrophic changes with advanced ages, it loses its distinctness. So the thing is, it is a good friend of mine if it is present. I know that even if there is tumor, it is not infiltrating. But if it is disrupted, I cannot be very certain that there is myometrial invasion. So over here, we have an intact enhancement almost all around. And on the delayed sequences, we see a very well delineated border, and I would say definitely it is not significantly involving the myometrium. Ovarian involvement, so here there is an ultrasound picture of the endometrial tumor. We see the endometrial tumor here confined to the endometrial cavity, but we are seeing a structure over here with a soft tissue. In the right ovary is okay, the left ovary shows something. The diffusion sequence shows restricted tumor, dark in the endometrium and dark on the in the ovary as well. So we would imagine that maybe this is a 1A3 and it may be an endometrioid type, which is a low grade, but essentially it has to be combined with your histology. Moving on to stage 2. So stage 2, we talk of again, how do we move ahead? If the tumor, which is not aggressive, is now entering into the stroma, it is a 2A. If there is lymphovascular stromal invasion, it becomes a 2B. Any aggressive tumor with any extent of myometrial invasion becomes a stage 2C. So if you just peep out here is to just ponder a 1C versus a 2C. If there is minimal myometrial invasion of an aggressive tumor, it directly jumps up a stage, which was not the case in the earlier case. So now if I look at this tumor here and there is an endometrial mass and there is loss of distinction and definitely more than 50% invasion in the posterior wall. But if I look at it completely, there is definite cervical invasion. So when there is cervical stromal invasion, it is going to upstage to stage 2. So this, so that was a stage 2, and LVSI we cannot comment, so we have to combine with the histopathology. Stage 3 essentially does not change in terms of adnexal involvement 3A1 and serosa or subserosa of the uterus. So usually when we see bosselated appearances of the serosa or we are seeing extraserosal possible involvement on an MRI, we are certain, but now even subserosa of the uterus. So if you are seeing the tumor pushing that serosal margin and jutting out, perhaps it may not be extraserosal, but it can be a stage 3A1, 3A2. 3B, again, there is vagina or parametrium involvement. 3B2 is there is pelvic peritoneal implants. So again, looking out for peritoneal implants, and especially if Buscopan is not given or glucagon is not given, and in the presence of bowel peristalsis, sometimes it can become tricky to detect peritoneal implants. So we need to look out for them. Stage 3C is in the presence of pelvic nodes, is 3C1, and 3C2 is para-aortic nodes up to the renal vessels. So if we have para-aortic nodes above the renal vessels, it upstages to stage 4. All right, again, something to remember. In an endometrium again, so it depends on the upper uterine surface, mid-uterine surface, or lower. A lower endometrial cancer is more likely to go to pelvic nodes, and upper 2/3 endometrial cancer is more likely to drain towards the iliac and the para-aortic nodes. Size criteria, which is not my friend at all, but to denote it, more than 8 millimeters in the pelvic area and more than 10 millimeters in the para-aortic nodes are likely, should be called as suspicious. But to read articles very clearly, many articles also quote to give emphasis on the morphology and not just the size. If the size is large, you call them suspicious. But if the size is not small, you do not deem them not suspicious. You have to look at the morphology, assess them, and then give your opinion. So moving on to stage 3, as I said, so there can be direct adnexal involvement in 3A. 3A2 is when there is subserosal involvement, and 3B is when we have parametrium or vaginal involvement. So this is an example on the CT scan. You don't need an MRI in such patients. There's so much of disease. There is adenopathy. There is extraserosal involvement. So we know this will be a stage 3A2. It's a waste of MRI to use an MRI for such cases. 3B1 is parametrial infiltration out here. So it is a uterocervical extension and definite parametrial invasion, also seen on the diffusion and ADC sequences. Whenever you're seeing the diffusion, please make a point to see the ADC as well. You cannot forget to see the ADC because you don't want to be wrong. 3C2, these are definite lower para-aortic nodes and they are suspicious. Coming to stage 4, bladder or bowel mucosa and not bullous edema, which we often talk in terms of cervix, also holds true over here. Extrapelvic peritoneal implants directly become a stage 4B. So it's important to see where that peritoneal implant was, whether it was in the pelvis or extrapelvis, and nodes above the renal vessels or inguinal nodes or any other distant size becomes a stage 4C. So these are definitely suspicious nodes above the renal vessels. Metastatic lesions, whether this was a tuberculoma or not, so clinical context is so essential. These are certain pictures of patients where it was an undiagnosed case of a cervical, of an endometrial tumor, and the differentials were really moving around tuberculoma. Thick enhancing wall out here, so this was a tumor, and the patient also had a fibrocavitary lesion. So sometimes she just had an abnormal vaginal bleed which was not asked for in a good history taking. So a complete imaging and history taking is so essential. Coming to the end stage, we said regional nodes are perivisceral, internal iliac, external iliac, common iliac, and para-aortic. We differentiated them. Short axis dimension, as I said, morphology is my favorite, and I always say morphology must trump over the size criteria. Pelvic nodal metastases are more common than para-aortic. Isolated para-aortic nodes can occur. Node-positive endometrial cancer is more common in tumors of higher stage and higher grade. That's how they're so important in prognostication. Role of MRI in staging, the staging accuracy of MRIs varies between 85% and 93%, and dynamic post-contrast imaging improves the accuracy and the depth of myometrial invasion. Pitfalls in accuracy of myometrial invasion are, as I said, with the endometrial enhancement. The ACR appropriateness criteria, NCCN guidelines, ESUR guidelines, and multidisciplinary European expert consensus meeting all recommend an MRI as a first modality of choice when available. Combining findings of MRI with hysteroscopic biopsy, they significantly improve the risk of nodal metastasis to be identified preoperatively with a very high accuracy. So just 3 cases that I would like to show. So what is the importance of staging in early disease? So we see this tumor out here, it is iso-intense, and there are some hypo-intense lines and bands here. In the axial section, nothing much, no invasion, and here definitely no invasion, it's out there, so I'm happy it's a endometrial confined disease. The diffusion restriction and dark on ADC, and the hypo-intense lines were intensely enhancing. So now I'm imagining it's a plexus of vessels and probably a polypoidal lesion. So maybe a polyp, but it was significantly restricted on diffusion. So maybe it's a polypoidal endometrial tumor is what I would say. And so if I feel whether it would be a stage 1A2 or stage 2C. So earlier days I could have given a stage, but now I cannot, because both may be correct, and that really depends on the histology, because something confined to the uterus can be a 1A1 or a 1C, and minimal invasion could be a 1B or a higher 2C also. So now staging has to be coupled with pathology. You have to look around. So here, when somebody reports this, okay, it's an endometrial mass, no rocket science out there. And on the post-contrast, I see probably I can debate and spend 5 minutes on thinking whether it is less than 50 or more than 50% invasion and come to an answer, and I report it that way as such. However, if I did not give cautious attention, there was this little sinister looking node. It is similar and it is hyper intense on T2. It must be about 4 millimeters, but I would definitely call this suspicious. The moment you have this node, it becomes a 3C1. You are less than 50, more than 50 does not stand true. So looking around at all corners is important, and morphology of the nodes is more important than the size criteria. Sometimes we work by instincts. So here, this is my last case where, I too was wondering what do I do next. So, okay, this worked on my screen, but it's not working here. I would have some still images though. So this is my fault. I mailed the presentation rather than sharing with a pen drive. Okay, I have one still image for sure. No, it worked. Okay. So look over here, there's this large fibroid that I see, and then I have the endometrial cavity. Something came and went, and there is this large thing out here. Now, how many ever times I was trying to see, I could see an endometrial tumor which is confined to the endometrial cavity. All right, so I'll just take a chance if the first one works, because we all love to see the sagittal T2 section first. I think he can control it. Great, thank you so much. All right, so we see that large fibroid there up in the fundus, and then you see the endometrial tumor out here and something out here. So I'm seeing some endometrial plaque-like tissue in the upper endometrium, and there's this nice little soft tissue distending. And then history of abnormal vaginal bleeding, and then family history. So she's almost 58, but her mom also had a very late menopause, and everybody in the family had late. So we're looking at hyper estrogenic state out here, and of course, everybody wanted to think it was a polyp. So now the question is, do we intervene or not? Could you run the video? Thank you. So these are the ADC images in the sagittal section. So ADC should be taken in 2 planes, all right, the diffusion and the ADC. So we look at the tumor here, the fibroid was dark, another dark fibroid. There is absolutely no restriction. We can forget all values of more than 1, more than 1.2 to call something suspicious, so this is not restricting, okay? And then we have the post-contrast imaging, and the post-contrast imaging, I have a still image where it is hardly enhancing and not much of invasion or anything. So if I have to report it as per the MRI, the diffusion is shouting out I'm benign, and the post-contrast may not help, but then anyways, the instincts were, if I can show you, yeah, so you have a polyp which is because of hyperestrogenic stage, but then all of these are not classical endometrial hypoplastic changes and whatever. So the instinct is, no, this doesn't look good and this has to be removed, and a biopsy is called for. So this was endometrioid carcinoma. The point is, and it was with minimal myometrial invasion, which was flagged earlier that there is some interface lost, but we were not sure because the diffusion was so misleading. So sometimes they don't follow textbooks, they don't follow articles, they don't listen to talks. So remember instincts, and whenever you have a hunch, it may not fit in, but please ask for a biopsy when required. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Palak, for giving the group such a thorough and up-to-the-minute information on this critical area of women's health. Thank you, ma'am. Next, I invite Dr. Rupa Anandasivan, Consultant Radiologist, Manipal Hospital, Bangalore, to discuss carcinoma cervix, what oncologist wants to know.
I have a marker. Idana? Thank you all for this wonderful invitation. It's been a wonderful conference, and I'm sure we're going to have lots more to look forward to tomorrow. But what I'd like to discuss in the next 20 minutes, which actually has been made, my task has been made really much more easy because of the previous talks, is to tell the oncologist, whether it's the medical oncologist, the radiation oncologist, or the surgical oncologist, what they want to know in carcinoma cervix. A few words about the disease. It is the 4th commonest cancer among women worldwide, and as usual, most of the deaths due to carcinoma cervix occur in low and middle income countries. India doesn't have a very good record. 25% of the global deaths occur in India, and the overall relative survival rate of carcinoma cervix is only 46. So 1 in 2 patients actually die of the disease. A little bit of the pathology. Most of carcinoma cervix is squamous cell, 70 to 80%. Then you have 20 to 25% of adenocarcinomas and some rare cancers. Signs and symptoms: early cancer cervix is asymptomatic. When it's more advanced, you get vaginal bleeding, especially the touch bleeding, pelvic pain, dyspareunia, and most of these, is particular in the early stages, are diagnosed by cervical cytology and by, that is the pap smear, and by biopsy. So a little about the anatomy. Squamous cell carcinoma, which is the commonest of the carcinoma cervix, occurs at the squamocolumnar junction, which in younger patients protrudes out into the vagina like that, while in older patients the squamous columnar junction is actually pulled into the endocervix. A little about the human papillomavirus positivity. 90% of carcinoma cervix are actually human papillomavirus positive. That's a good sign. We pick them up in the earlier stages. They are seen in younger patients, while actually human papillomavirus negative patients are less. They are seen in older patients and usually an advanced stage. And one more difference between the younger and the older patients is younger women have carcinoma cervix which is exophytic, and that's because the squamocolumnar junction is outside, it protrudes into the vagina, while older women have a more diffuse infiltrative endocervical sort of cancer because the squamocolumnar junction is pulled inwards. Little about the staging. The 2 major stagings we've talked about is the FIGO and the TNM, and that's a very busy slide, and that's just comparing the FIGO classification with the TNM classification. But if you put it all together, it's just quite simple, okay? Carcinoma in situ you have is stage 0. You have T1 or stage 1, which is carcinoma cervix confined to the cervix. If in stage 2 or T2, it spreads to the upper vagina or the parametrium. In stage 3, you have spread to the lower vagina, the pelvic side wall, hydronephrosis, and lymph nodes, as we'll talk about shortly. And in stage 4 or T4, it spreads to the adjacent or to the distant organs. So all of that is compiled in these 2 classifications, and each of these stages have ABC. So we'll look at that as we go along. And now FIGO over the years, right up till 2018, FIGO was managed by all these obstetricians and gynecologists. They really wouldn't let imaging get an official place, okay? So right up to 2018, it relied primarily on clinical examination. We were all doing MRs, all over the world MRs was being done, but the FIGO classification accepted us only in 2018. There was frequent under and over staging. Lymph nodes was not included in the staging, but since the 2018 revision, It aligns with the current practice of using advanced imaging. So now it's official. Imagiologists are very important in staging of carcinoma cervix, and imaging and pathology complement physical examination. So why is imaging so important to the oncologist? One important thing is the treatment. The treatment differs upon the stage, and the stage is decided by imaging. So early cancers, that is, we look at this thing, that is early 1 or early 2A, less bulkier cancers, that is less than 4 centimeters, are treated with upfront surgery. More advanced cancers, that is either more than 2A, but sometimes in 1B also we look at that. Cancers which are more than 4 centimeters are actually treated with chemoradiation, that is external radiation with brachytherapy. They have a very good response, especially with squamous cell carcinomas. Review is done after 4 to 6 weeks. If there is a complete response, which again imaging will diagnose for them, the treatment is complete. If there is a poor response, they will have a repeat chemoradiation, and then probably surgical options will be considered. So at every point here, imaging is important. So what is the imaging we can give for carcinoma cervix? You have ultrasound, CT, MR, and PET CT, and of course PET MR. So ultrasound still does well, particularly in very good hands. You have a large hypoechoic heterogeneous tumor. You can tell the size, whether it's a bulky tumor, more than 4 centimeters, which cannot undergo surgery, or if it's less than 4 centimeters, if the patient desires surgery, we can do it. In very good hands, we can diagnose parametral invasion, vaginal invasion, and of course hydronephrosis and ureteric invasion. CT, however, is more useful in advanced disease, sometimes in monitoring treatment, looking for lymphadenopathy, but it plays a very important role with the radiation oncologist because it helps to plan radiation, okay? And it, of course, guides percutaneous biopsies when required. But the workhorse and the gold standard for imaging of carcinoma cervix is MR. It helps in accurate staging in early disease, advanced disease. It helps to plan treatment. Treatment response is beautifully assessed on MR. It helps to detect recurrence, and it helps for planning surgery also, okay? And generally, carcinoma cervix is iso-intense on T1, but it's nice and hyper-intense on T2. So that is our main workhorse. The T2 weighted images is our main workhorse because it's beautifully seen on T2 weighted images. A few lines about the anatomy. Okay, so that's the cervical canal, and the opening between the endometrial cavity and the endocervical canal is the internal os. The opening between the cervical canal and the vagina is the external os, and on a T2 weighted image, the position of the bladder neck helps diagnose the upper 2/3 of the vagina and the lower 1/3 of the vagina, which is very important in staging. So that's some landmarks which is good for you to remember. And normal anatomy is very beautifully evaluated on a T2 weighted sagittal image in particular. Okay, so you can see the hyper-intense cervical mucosa, the T2 hypo-intense cervical stroma over there, and it's beautifully demonstrated on axial images, which we'll see as we go along. You can see the internal os, the external os. But remember, this zonal anatomy is best seen in the reproductive age group. In the postmenopausal age group, the zonal anatomy of particularly of the uterus, but also of the cervix to a certain extent, is not very well distinguishable. So this has already been covered, the cervical cancer, the MR protocol, very beautifully by Dr. Atul, thank you. So what the workhorse, as he said, is a small FOV, T2 weighted images, at least in 2 planes. Most of our institutions do it in 3 planes, and then you have a large FOV, which can be T1 or T2, depending upon the institution, looking for spread in the surrounding areas. Always in carcinoma cervix, combined with diffusion weighted images. We usually do it only in 1 plane. It can be done in axial and sagittal or coronal, depending upon institutional variations. This has also been covered, the importance of taking your axial and coronal images in the area of interest, not in the pelvis, not the axis, the axial pelvis we're looking for. It is the axial cervix we're looking at. Importance of saturation bands is very important, particularly in elderly obese patients, to put your saturation bands anteriorly. Otherwise, you'll get a carcinoma cervix where you really can't see the anterior and posterior border, particularly on the axial images. If you really want to see the T2 hypo-intense stroma, which will tell you what stage the carcinoma is, you need very good images, and that's why it's very important that you put that saturation images to avoid saturation bands to avoid motion artifacts. Okay. Now let's look at the staging. Okay. So stage 1, as I said, is confined to the cervix. Stage 1A is less than 5 millimeters, and for all practical purposes, it is microscopic. You really can't image it. Stage 1B and above is where imagiologists come in, and 1B is more than 5 millimeters depth, and depending upon the extent, it is B1 less than 2 centimeters, B2 is 2 to 4 centimeters, and B3 is more than 4 centimeters. And we'll notice that this 4 is very important because anything more than 4 is very difficult for the surgeon to tackle, and anything more than 2 centimeters is really not conducive to fertility preserving surgery. So you can see a small area of a T2 hyper intensity confined to the cervix, and you can get the measurements of that. So that's how we do the dimensions of cancer confined to the cervix, that is stage 1. One important point we have to give the oncologist is to confirm that there is no parametral invasion. Then only it becomes stage 1. Otherwise it goes on to stage 2. And so for that you need very well taken T2 axial images, which will show you the T2 hypo-intensity around the hyper-intense cancer. So you can see that very nicely seen, despite that's the intermediate signal tumor there with a nice T2 hypo-intense rim showing that there is no parametral invasion. Okay, the greatest dimensions of the tumor are also important. Most of us do it on sagittal images, but a good number of imagiologists also like the coronal images to give the maximum dimension of the tumor. Stage 2 is, of course, beyond the uterus, but not to the lower vagina or not to the pelvic side wall. So that means it's the upper vagina or it is into the parametrum without pelvic side wall involvement. So generally, a nice T2 weighted image will show you the vaginal involvement quite well. And you might be thinking, I mean, this is coming from a gynecologist. Do we really need to tell the vaginal involvement? Can't they see it? But it's actually quite difficult because many of these patients do have vaginal stenosis, and also in large bulky tumors, it's a bit difficult for them to say whether it's the bulky tumor itself which is coming into the projecting into the vagina, or is there actual vaginal involvement. So it's best seen on MR, but even on PET CT, sometimes you can see the nice projection on this sagittal images of the tumor into the vagina. Stage 2B means there is parametral invasion. So that's a very important point we have to give the oncologist, because it's sometimes very difficult for them to say in bulky tumors whether the parametrum is involved or not, because clinically, sometimes it becomes very difficult, but it's very beautifully seen on MR. So, why does parametral involvement occur? It's because the vessels which penetrate the cervical stroma going into the endocervical canal allows spread of cancer out through those areas of vessel penetration. And parametral invasion generally is divided into two: the nodular type. So many of the cancers, instead of these large bulky things which have a nodular type of parametral invasion, and a more spiculated type of parametral invasion which goes along the vessels which penetrate the cervical stroma. So you can see this is a more nodular type of cervical cancer. So it looks a bit difficult, but if you look carefully, you can see there's a nice T2 hypo-intense rim all around except in the right lateral border, showing that there is cervical stromal involvement in the right side. Okay, again, spiculated versus a nodular. You can see it's very easy to diagnose spiculated parametral parametral invasion. It's a little more difficult when it's a nodular sort of invasion, but if you follow the cervical stroma carefully, you can see as you come to the right lateral border, there is definitely invasion of the cervical stroma by that nodular tumor. So from 2A, we've looked at 2A and 2B. Now we go to stage 3. So stage 3 is now divided into A, B, and we look at C. A is when there is involvement of the lower vagina. And we said that the bladder neck on the sagittal image shows us the division of the upper 2/3 and lower 1/3. And parametral invasion extending into the pelvic side wall with or without involvement of the ureter, resulting in hydronephrosis. And of course, since 2018 and the latest 9th edition of the AJCC, we've got the lymph node involvement also in 3C, which I'll go through as we go along. Okay, so again, generally transvaginal contrast, it used to be quite popular in most institutes. Generally transvaginal contrast is really not used these days, but especially if you need to see the vaginal invasion, it really helps. This is transvaginal contrast over there. You can see the vaginal invasion extending below the bladder neck, indicating that it is no longer 2A, it has become 3A. What about parametral invasion and the pelvic side wall involvement? Again, beautifully seen on T2 weighted axial images. So there is parametral invasion, but if you have to say the pelvic side wall is involved, there should be invasion or an extent of less than 3 millimeters of the tumor, either from the obturator internus or the piriformis, or invasion of the ileus, or invasion of the levator ani, which you can nicely see on coronal images. And then we have 3C. 3C is lymph node involvement. Again, there is a 3C1 and a 3C2 involving the lymph nodes in the pelvis or in the para-aortic region. So the lymph nodes we look for carefully when we have a carcinoma cervix or any gynecological malignancy would be the inferior epigastric, the external iliac, the obturator or the internal iliac, and the sacral lymph nodes. So we said N1 or 3C1 are pelvic lymph nodes, usually seen well if you look carefully on MR, but when you have very small lymph nodes, just borderline, you can look at the morphology, but perhaps PET CT or PET MR will beautifully pick up the FDG and show you those pelvic lymph nodes very well. N2 is para-aortic lymph nodes. It's very important. We tell this, the radiation oncologists that there is para-aortic lymph nodes for them to include it in the radiation field. And when the para-aortic lymph nodes extend above the renal hilum, that means you're looking at stage 4, that is M1. So lymph nodes above the renal hilum or inguinal lymph nodes on MRI or any of your imaging indicates actually metastasis. So that's a very important point you have to tell the treating oncologist. And then we come to stage 4. Stage 4A refers to involvement of the adjacent organs, the urinary bladder or the rectum. Stage 4B is distant metastasis, and it's important to diagnose the tumor going right into the bladder, showing an intraluminal mass. That's stage 4, and this is just bullous edema, so it's just a bit of edema along the wall. There is no direct extension of the tumor into the bladder. M stage is of course 4B, and we talked about para-aortic lymph nodes above the renal hilum. We talked about inguinal lymph nodes, intraperitoneal disease, involvement of the lung, liver, bone, often picked up on PET CT or PET MR, will upstage the disease to stage 4B. These are important areas we have to look for to upstage the disease. Okay, do we use a contrast in for carcinoma cervix? Really not as a routine. Sometimes it's used in post chemo radiation therapy, sometimes to see the tumor extent. So small tumors can enhance with contrast, larger tumors can be quite necrotic and they may not enhance. Diffusion has an important role, useful in small tumors to see the extent, and also in chemo radiation therapy response, as we will see as we go along. So treatment response is important. So what after chemo radiation, 4 to 6 weeks later, we reassess the patient. If there is a disappearance of a lesion on T2, if there is a disappearance of a diffusion restriction, and if we have given contrast, there is a disappearance of the enhancing lesion, that indicates a complete response. Okay, so this is a patient with a stage 1 tumor. You can see the hospital number is same in 2023 December, and in February of 2024, you can see that there is a complete response of that T2 hyperintense lesion seen in the cervix. So that is a complete response. The diffusion also is playing an important role in picking up complete response, and you can see both the brightness on diffusion as well as the ADC values completely disappear with tumor response. So just going through the chart again, what we need to tell the treating oncologist on MRI: what is the stage of the disease? Is the size of the lesion less than 4 centimeters? So probably this patient can undergo surgery. If it is a stage 1, probably early 2A, patient could even undergo fertility sparing surgery, which we look at as we go across. And if it's a more invasive cancer, we look for parametrial invasion, involvement of lower vagina, and of course involvement of the lymph nodes. So just a final thing of the MRI checklist: is the tumor more than 4 centimeters? That's important. Is there parametrial invasion? Is important. Is there vaginal invasion? Is it the upper 2/3 or the lower 1/3? Is there pelvic side wall involvement? Is there bladder or rectal involvement? And can we see the lymph nodes on MR? The surgical considerations, even for small tumors, is the distance of the tumor from the internal cervical os to ease infertility sparing. So if you see a small tumor, how close it is to the internal os. It's important to give the surgeon also the total uterine size. This is a very large and uterus. So would they be able to do lap versus open surgery? Are there any associated benign conditions like adenomyosis? And is there any anatomical variations? Fertility preservation only possible if the tumor is 1B1, less than 2 centimeters, and if there is less than 1 centimeter between the tumor and the internal os. Okay. PET CT, important to not only identify the FDG with primary, but look for lymph nodes in the pelvis, in the parietic region, above the renal hilum. Look carefully for distant metastasis, ideally together with a PET MR or at least a fused image. So in conclusion, the workhouse for a carcinoma cervix is MRI, together with PET CT and PET MR if you have that. T2-weighted sequences with diffusion are our most important workhouse. Importance of getting good images, because you won't be able to actually stage the disease unless you have good images. So then you can get accurate staging and you can give a good treatment response. So you can give them what you want if you have your ideal images. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, ma'am, for that insightful presentation. It's so important for us to understand the clinical questions that guide our work. Once again, thank you, ma'am. Our final speaker for the session is Dr. Shikha Khandelwal, Consultant Radiologist, Gujarat Imaging Center, who will lead a case-based discussion, Approach to Imaging of Adnexal Masses.
A very good evening to everyone. So finally on the final session, I would like to thank the organizing committee, Bhavna ma'am and Rupa ma'am, for having me here. And Coimbatore has such a nice weather as compared to Ahmedabad. So, so we have USG, and USG is a first line investigation, but still 20 to 30% of the cases will be indeterminate on USG. So then we have to move on CT, MRI, PET CT, biopsies, laparoscopies, and so on and so forth. So in the next 20 minutes or so, we'll see few cases. Most of them will have typical imaging findings, as I can see most of the residents being sitting here, and few cases where we went wrong and what mistakes that we did.
So as the video is scrolling down, the USG had ascites and omental thickening, and similar thing was seen on CT itself. There is moderate ascites, omental caking, peritoneal nodularity, and a bulky adenexa. So what next? Ascitic tapping. The ascitic cytology was a metastatic carcinoma. The fluid cytology was negative for AFP, for Gene Expert was negative, and her CA125 was 823. So what we have ascites, omental caking, peritoneal nodularity, we have fluid cytology positive, we have raised CA125. Still, they went ahead with a PET. There was a right supraclavicular node, FDG avid retroperitoneal abdominal nodes, omental caking, and just bulky adenexa. Young patient. So what's the point that I'm telling here is the report was based on multiple factors. We had positive ascitic tapping. So it's a malignant disease that they mentioned, likely ovarian, multiple nodes, and this was the diagnosis. The case came for a relook, and now can you see the uptake which you can see is the bladder one. The adenexa they don't have any disease except a little thickening is there and a little FDG avidity is there. So we asked for a biopsy of the omentum and a right supraclavicular node, and that turned out to be Cox. So the point here is don't just get biased by CA125. CA125 can be elevated in n number of things, chronically inflamed peritoneum, in endometriosis, and so many other things. Fluid cytology, it can be negative, it can be falsely positive also. Go with the age, go with your imaging features. That was a jigsaw puzzle. We just fitted our diagnosis since CA125 was raised, since the ascitic fluid was positive. But that was not the case. This turned out to be a granulomatous involvement everywhere. And this was done. That case we did last week, and after 2 days we did this case. Again, ascites, omental thickening, peritoneal nodularity, but now you can see bulky adenexa, bulky ovaries where solid and cystic lesions were present. So this was a diagnosed case of disseminated CA ovary. Coming to the second case, we look at these images. So many times we get that bulky lesions, too big a lesion in the pelvis, and we fail to identify from which compartment it is coming and what is the pathology of that lesion. So try to identify the compartment of origin when you have indeterminate adenexial lesions. Identify normal ovaries. If a normal ipsilateral ovary is not found, try to follow the gonadal vessels. Sometimes these are enlarged like this. So you can say that this could be an ovarian pathology. And if the mass abuts the ovary, then try to find out the relationship of that mass with the ovary. So you have these many signs: beak sign, phantom organ sign, claw sign, where uterine tissue is draped over the lesion, and you can confidently say that this is not an ovarian lesion, this is a uterine lesion which is projecting into the adenexa. Bridging vessel sign, where you can see a subserosal fibroid having a bridging vessel from the uterine tissue and supplying the fibroid. And then of course you need to see whether the lesion is intraperitoneal or extraperitoneal. There are too many good articles. Displacement of organs can sometimes suggest you whether you are dealing with an extraperitoneal lesion, a medial or anterior displacement of iliac vessels and ureter, or uterus anterior displacement can suggest that this lesion could be an extraperitoneal. So that is what I was talking about, the claw sign. This lesion, this patient had an adenexial lesion on left side on USG. So came for an MR. You can see that there is a normal left ovary. The uterine tissue is draped over this lesion. This was a cystic adenoma. 52-year-old female with decreased appetite, weakness, weight loss 13 kg in 1 year. USG again had a large lesion in left paracentral lower abdomen, and they raised a doubt of an ovarian etiology. So try to see the video. We have few lymph nodes, a large heterogenously enhancing lesion with necrosis in midline and left adnexa. Right ovary is seen normally, but on CT also, like USG, we were not able to identify whether the ovaries are separate or not. So what next? So these are the coronal planes. Still, we were not able to find out whether the ovaries are normal or not. Now, as I'm scrolling down, if we can identify normal ovaries on MR, so the purpose of showing these cases is that sometimes one modality is not good enough, and most of the time it is like that only. So this is the uterus. Patient is 52 years, postmenopausal, so the ovaries are bound and expected to be small. This is the right ovary, and probably this is the left ovary. See the sigmoid colon displacement and the peritoneal reflection, which is drabbed over it. That's the sagittal plane, of course separated way beyond the uterus, and now we are seeing the ovaries also. We have seen the displacement of the organs. The morphology of the lesion, though it is relatively well circumscribed, still it is very heterogeneous. Go to your diffusion weighted images. The diffusion was 0.3, 0.4. So that was a PET scan. I'm sorry for that image quality, but that was taken by phone. So it was an FDG avid lesion. So now what we have separate ovaries, uterus is separate, probably an extraperitoneal lesion, which looks malignant because of heterogeneous internal characteristics and diffusion restriction. This turned out to be a retroperitoneal lesion, a high-grade leiomyosarcoma. 34-year female, lower abdominal pain. We did this MR in Feb last year, and we thought that the ovaries are separate. Right adnexal lesion. We presumed that this could be a corpus luteal cyst, and this was a left ovary. Uterus is very separate. So as I said, we get biased. We were biased. The lesion looked relatively homogeneous, though it was not very homogeneous. We thought that this was an ovary with a corpus luteal cyst, and the age of the patient. She was too young. So then we gave this as a broad ligament fibroid, and after 7 months, the same patient, we asked for a follow-up, she didn't turn up. After the 7 months, the same patient had this big lesion. So of course, we were wrong at the first place. Now we cannot see the right ovary separate. Left ovary was normal in the previous scans also. Young patient, no differential, it has to be malignant. So this was a diffusion which was restricting, and this turned out to be a serous high-grade carcinoma. So the point is, don't get biased by the age also. Sometimes young age can have COX, sometimes young age can have malignancies also. We may get mistaken in identifying the ovaries. Try to look very carefully if the ovaries are seen separately from the lesion or they are involved. And of course, if still you are in doubt, always counsel the patient and talk to the consultant that we need a follow-up of this patient, or whatever, if they want to go ahead with a biopsy, or else a very close follow-up. So then we have decided the compartment of origin. We have seen the age, seromarkers. Now see the signal intensities on T1 and T2 weighted images. These are the charts all over on the things, the morphological appearance based classification of the ovarian lesions, the histological based classification. I'm not going to go in all this. And then of course there is ORADS, which itself will take another 20 minutes if we go on discussing the ORADS, which helps us at least to to risk for the risk assessment of these patients. So let's see the signal intensities. These are the T1 weighted fat set images. Bright on T1 fat set shows shading on T2 weighted images. Classical findings, these are the bilateral ovarian endometriomas. How to differentiate from, sometimes we have only unilateral endometriomas and we might get confused with the hemorrhagic. So either ask for a follow-up or usually the endometriomas are more brighter, more homogeneous. They can have a T2 dark spot sign also. Another thing that I would emphasize is always try to follow the structural reporting even with endometriosis for everything. For CA cervix, C endometrium, for everything. Try to find out the things that are necessary for a laparoscopic surgeon or for the treating consultant. So do mention the superficial and deep implants if at all they are there. Just a companion case, bright lesion on T1 weighted without fat set images, which shows fall in signal intensity. So there is no discussion on this as such. Heterogeneous on T2, identify the ovaries. What is important is to identify whether they can preserve the ovary or not. This is an ovarian dermoid and that doesn't require our skills to identify, but then the surgeon would prefer to know that whether they can preserve the ovarian tissue or not. Again, the same ovarian dermoid. If you come across the fluid signals like this is hypo on T1, bright on T2, no diffusion restriction, few septations, no nodules, so that's a classical ovarian cystadenoma. So there is one another sign which we discussed, phantom organ sign. That means if the mass is arising from a small area like small ovaries, and so the ovaries may not be seen nicely, or that means the ovaries are involved. The pathology of the lesion is ovarian etiology. 23-year-old female with abdominal discomfort, USG suggested serous cystadenomas, bilateral. So again, MR, these are the T2 weighted images, and you can see a nodule was there in that T1 weighted fat set images. So we are sure that this cannot be serous cystadenoma at least. These are bright on T1 fat set images, but what to do of this nodule now? So go for your dynamic post-contrast. Don't just take routine post-contrast image. Try to get a dynamic post-contrast and identify whether that nodule is enhancing or not. So this was not enhancing. So that turned out to be a simple endometriotic cyst and not cystadenoma, which was reported on sono. Young female, lower abdominal pain, USG suggested ovarian cyst. So that was a cystadenoma. Why I'm showing this case is you can see that some ovarian tissue is here. So that is how you identify whether that the lesion is from the ovaries. But see some hypointensity at the inferior margin. On fat sat images, this is a little bright. So that means some hemorrhagic area is there. What the laparoscopic surgeon would prefer to know is if there is a serous cystadenoma, how are the ovaries of that side? That was the gradient images. And on post contrast, that area was not enhancing. So this was a serous cystadenoma with an hemorrhagic transformation of a sequelae of an ovarian torsion which she might had previously. And probably the entire ovary was involved and they couldn't save anything out of that. So it's not just about the diagnosis, we need to answer the concerns of the clinicians also. That was a simple ovarian torsion which we see, peripherally based follicles. If the lesion is not following fluid signals, so this is a heterogeneous lesion, you have stained glass appearance like multiple different signal intensities in the same lesion. Multilocular lesion, stained glass appearance, no solid component, no enhancement, so this is a mucinous cystadenoma. Clinicians would prefer knowing that whether it is serous or mucinous because they don't want to spill the mucin content, they want to take it out and block. So at least we should be mentioning whether how it is, the contents are. If you see solid components and those solid components shows enhancement on CT or diffusion restriction on MRI or vascularity on your Doppler images, that is carcinoma. This was a serous cyst adenocarcinoma. Young patient, 33-year-old female, she had been, had PCOD and drilling and hysteroscopy was done, and previous MRI and CT told that there was an endometrioma. Came for an imaging, so the PCOD morphology is there in the ovaries, bilateral ovaries, but what we notice is that there is a solid tissue on the left side, and these are the T1 fat set images, few locules of hemorrhage. Post-contrast images, these solid areas enhance. So again, this is an endometrioid adenocarcinoma. Two malignancies are commonly with endometriosis, that is endometrioid adenocarcinoma and clear cell histology. They can be seen, so whenever you see endometriotic patient, try to look for any solid mural nodule, if it is there or not. 41-year female operated for chocolate cyst previously. So this is straightforward. There is a multilocular cystic lesion, solid nodule. That was a T2 weighted images. T1 fat set shows hemorrhagic component. So these are the T1 fat set images. So this is clear cell carcinoma with adenofibroma-like stroma. So whenever endometriosis, just try to find out whether they are not dealing with any malignancy or not. 54-year female with hysterectomy and bilateral salpingophorectomy and now abdominal pain. Left hydronephrosis, lesion in pelvis. She already had hysterectomy, bilateral oophorectomy was done. What this could be? So the same thing that we saw on CT, malignant looking lesion, that was seen on MR also. Still we were not able to identify what could this be, except that we were sure that this has to be malignancy. Operated, this turned out to be an endometrioid adenocarcinoma again. No matter the ovaries were removed. So hysterectomy or oophorectomy, that doesn't exclude the possibility of that patient having an ovarian malignancy. Ovarian remnants can be there, and this is more so with a patient with endometriosis. Easy case, that is something in the tubes, diffusion restriction, that was a tubo-ovarian lesion. You see and go to meet the history and check the patient, fever, pain, raised WBC counts, that was a fungal ovarian hyphae with oophorytis and chronic salpingitis. Postmenopausal spotting, USG had a lesion. I'll be a little fast. So there was an endometrial thickening, distension, and a left ovarian lesion. So granulosa cell tumors, they are the tumors of the ovarian, they produce estrogen and hence they lead to that endometrial thickening. So you can take your diffusion weighted images, find out there is nothing else in the endometrial cavity. Post hysterectomy, right ovary is not seen separately from the lesion, and so this was a lesion in the right adenexa. A little hypo on T2, diffusion shows diffusion restriction, not much enhancement. Hysterectomy has been done. We don't know the status of ovaries. They usually, if the hysterectomy is done in a young age, they can preserve the ovaries. That was a PET scan. So that turned out to be a fibroma. Fibroma, fibrothecomas, Brenner's tumors. See the T2 signals. T2 signals are hypointense. Then you are pretty sure that these tumors are of benign etiology. I'll have two more cases. So these are the multilocular cyst, bilateral adenexa, young patient. Something is there in the uterus. Can anyone suggest what is this? Now it's easy. DNC has already been done. Her beta HCG was raised and still they were raised even after the DNC. That was an H-mole with thecal uterine cyst. Last case, abdominal cox, treated for 2 years. She had an iliopsoas abscess also, on USG, ascites and omental thickening. Again, the diagnostic dilemma that we have been seeing from the first case, whether it is cox, because that's the most common in our subset. So that's the CT. Some omental thickening is there, inframesocolic here. I think the ovaries are seen separately on CT also, and there was this lesion on the left side. Can you appreciate with a small vessel? We just wanted to confirm our diagnosis, went on with the MR. So that was in a hemoperitoneum. It is not a fluid signal. It's not just routine ascites. This was a hemoperitoneum. Both ovaries are nicely seen and the lesion is here. So what this is? Everyone needs coffee or tea. So that was an ectopic pregnancy, fallopian tube. Point was that you identified normal ovaries, there was a hemoperitoneum, and you can see some suspicious lesion in the adnexal region. So to finish off, identify the organ of origin whenever you are dealing with the adnexal lesions, narrow down your differentials, use combination of imaging, sono, CT, MR, whatever is available. Don't forget dynamic contrast and diffusion on MRI. Never ever miss history and clinical inputs that are given to you. Try to meet the patients. Most of the times, many of the things are solved just by talking and meeting to the patients. Adopt lexicon wherever you can, like in CA, endometrium or cervix, even with ovary also, peritoneal carcinomatosis index if the consultants wants that. And always talk to your referring physicians. What they want sometimes is completely different what we offer to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving us a glimpse into your expert approach to these challenging cases.
Just a second. On behalf of our Society of Gynecological Imaging and Interventions, I would, this is a recently formed society, and we recently had its 3rd annual conference. And I would like all of you who are interested in imaging female pelvis to be a part of it. The membership forms can be taken by Bhavna ma'am or by me, and we would love to have you all in that society. It's an upcoming society and will soon be very well established. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. We now open to the discussion session.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Atul, Dr. Palak, Dr. Rupa, and Dr. Shikha for this wonderful session. So just to conclude, basically all 3 speakers in their first talks, they said, you have to actually, uterus is like it's dancing in your own body, okay? And it's not that it's same in one woman at one point of a time. It can be different, okay? It can change its position. So it's very, very important to tell your technologist to, align the, if you are, imaging uterus, myometrium or endometrium or vagina in a proper fashion, how all 3 speakers have told you. And also the second point is that, you should image it at a right, when you're seeing the perfusion, it should be taken at a right time. Okay, so then only you'll be able to differentiate the minor things between the stage 2A and 2Bs. Also, I think what Dr. Shikha was trying to tell, think of something, which is not very common. Okay, when you are, you see there can be a lot of things which can happen. Okay, and she showed beautiful cases. So you have to think out of the box sometimes, and you need to use different, modalities. And ultrasound now, it's so good. I think we can use whenever we are doing MR or CT, ultrasound really helps us. So with this, I have some questions for the speakers. Can you project the questions here, or shall I read? Huh?
You can read.
Okay. So I'll start from the below. Dr. Shikha, difference between the claw sign and beak sign. I know you claw sign and beak sign. You showed a beautiful diagram, but somebody has asked. Can somebody give the mic, please?
So claw is like a claw. It's usually used for a uterine lesion. So it is draped over the lesion, whereas beak sign is just that the ovarian tissue or the organ of the origin, and the lesion is just hanging out of it. You just see that it is coming out of it.
Another question, Dr. Shikha, to Dr. Shikha. Ma'am, that young patient case, after how long we need to follow up? If we suggested her MRI in first time itself, will it
I
help
think,
her?
I think the one who is asking for the broad ligament fibroid case. That was a difficult one, and we missed completely that case. It's not about just being a follow-up. If you're not sure, then most of the times in our setting, the consultants would prefer going for a laparoscopic surgeries in these patients. But if patient is not, the young patients, they want fertility preservation. There are so many issues with those patients. But then 3 months is good enough for a interval follow-up on sono. At least you will know the stability of the lesion.
Thank you, Shikha.
The next question is for the endometrial cancer talk. What are the differentiating features between aggressive and non-aggressive endometrial neoplasms? Can we do it by MRI? How do you say it is 1A and 1C?
Histopathology, and that is where we lack. But
They want to know if there are any features
So
you
that-
can say by MRI.
So certain features that are postulated maybe is the extent of restriction of diffusion, that maybe there is lesser extent of restricted diffusion or ADC value for the lower grade tumors versus the high grade tumors. But essentially we've not seen really many of these differences. And so also for the vascular enhancement, if tumors are very variegated and intensely enhancing and earlier enhancing, we can presume by logic, as all other body sites, that they're going to be more of a higher grade or more aggressive. But honestly, we fall and we fail on both sides. So essentially, it is histopathological diagnosis.
Yeah, in ultrasound, we have few features to differentiate like aggressive and non-aggressive. These were points put forth by the ISWAG talks. They say that bulkier the tumor and more the color score, more heterogeneous the lesions, they are all like pointers for
Right. So exactly
higher grade
translating them
tumors.
on an MR, heterogeneity on T2 and earlier enhancement, more intense enhancement, more variegated, and more extent of restricted diffusion as an ADC value will be lower. They're all pointers towards higher grade, but as I said, it's good to write that in the exam. Clinically, we may fall on either side, so we should probably restrict to where we are and ask for a combined histological diagnosis, and then comes the staging part of it.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Rupa, ma'am, there's a question for you. How to differentiate between cervical adenoma malignum and multiple infected Nabothian follicles?
That's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer to that, because that is one of the questions which keep coming up. But I think one point is generally the Nabothian cysts are more or less the same size, except one may be a little more bigger. While in adenoma malignum, generally you will see those cystic spaces are very, very varied in size and shape. That's number one. Number two, if there is an underlying, a polyposis syndrome or something, you'd have to look for it. But otherwise, it's actually very difficult to distinguish between adenoma malignum and multiple infected Nabothian cysts. It's a combined imaging and a direct examination and probably a biopsy which helps to distinguishing both.
Dr. Pallak, there's a question for you. If there is an adenomyosis and the endomyometrial junction is altered, how in that case do you define the myometrial invasion, depth of myometrial invasion in endometrial CA?
Right, so we would use a combination and triangulation between T2, diffusion and post-contrast. So usually diffusion and post-contrast as a combination are better than T2 alone. But in this particular scenario, a T2 is going to help significantly. So either you're looking at an adenomyoma, where it will be seen well on the T2, or you're seeing adenomyosis, which also has a very specific imaging morphology on T2. So both these are signature findings on the T2, I would say. In this case, if you just look at the post-contrast, we will miss the buzz because we don't have the endometrial enhancement option. it doesn't help us. The myometal invasion may or may not help. So what I would do is ideally triangulate that T2 finding and with the post-contrast imaging, so we would know, exactly whether it is truly invading or not. So I think triangulation helps here. And the other thing that I often also say is, can we talk? Thank you. Is bladder distension. So we want patients to be well hydrated for all post-contrast scans, but for endometrium especially, even cervix is not a problem because it comes below the bladder, behind the bladder. Endometrium flaps, literally the uterus flaps with the distension of bladder. So whenever you're suspecting endometrium, try not to keep pumping in water for the patient about 2 hours prior to surgery, prior to the scan, because the patient will go to void, and once the patient goes to void, even after that, in a well-hydrated body, the bladder distends very fast. So when you want that precise triangulation between the T2, diffusion, and post-contrast, it does not happen if the bladder distends by the time the contrast happens. It's a very practical point, but try doing that, then the triangulation is better.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
I think thank you all for this session. I thank the speakers also. Any other questions, you can ask them directly. Thank you so much.
That was an enlightening discussion. We appreciate you not only sharing your expertise, but also addressing the practical issues that are so important to work. We thank the chairpersons once again. We will now have a final podium resident paper presentation of the day. I request our chairpersons to stay for the final podium resident paper presentation. I welcome Dr. Deekshika Sharma to present her paper.
Good evening, everyone. Title of my presentation is Diagnostic Accuracy of International Endometrial Tumor Analysis Parameters to Differentiate Benign and Malignant Endometrial Pathology. So is the primary objective of this study. Secondary objective is to calculate cutoff values using a simple scoring method based on these ITA parameters to differentiate between benign and malignant endometrial pathology. So this was a prospective observational cross-sectional study which included 53 adult women with abnormal uterine bleeding who had abnormal endometrium and underwent histopathological evaluation. So transvaginal ultrasound was done and ITA parameters were recorded. So grayscale parameters were endometrial thickness and endometrial echogenicity, appearance of endomyometrial junction, midline endometrium, echogenicity of intracavitary fluid, and presence of bright edge on Doppler. Doppler score and vascular pattern was recorded, and based on these parameters, diagnosis was made and score was calculated, which was correlated with histopathology. So this is the scoring method we used, given by Lin et al. So they assigned different scores to different parameters, different ITA parameters, based on the likelihood of the malignancy in the increasing order. For example, thickened endometrium and heterogeneous echogenicity were assigned higher scores. So results. So in our study, the presence of linear midline endometrium, presence of bright edge, and a multiple vessel pattern had sensitivity of 100% in differentiating benign and malignant endometrial pathologies, and highest diagnostic accuracy was found in vascular pattern and endomyometrial junction. So these are few representative cases. So case 1, 38-year-old lady with irregular menstrual bleeding. So TVS was done and ITA parameters were recorded. So the lesion here is homogeneously hyperechoic, uniform. Linear midline endometrium is seen and endomyometrial junction is regular. There is minimal vascularity and linear single vessel pattern is seen. So score of 3 was assigned, and on histopathology it was endometrial polyp. Case 2, 37-year-old lady with heavy menstrual bleeding. So in this, endometrium is heterogeneous. There is linear midline endometrium. Endomyometrial junction is regular. There is no color on Doppler. So score of 4 was assigned, and on histopathology, it was endometrial hyperplasia without atypia. Third case, a 55-year-old lady with postmenopausal spotting PV. So in this, the ET is markedly thickened, heterogeneous with irregular cystic areas. There is minimal multifocal vascularity. Endomyometrial junction is irregular in this fundus region, and we are not able to see the midline endometrium. So on histopathology, it was cystic endometrial hyperplasia. Case 4, 36-year-old lady, follow-up case of mucinous cyst adenocarcinoma with heavy menstrual bleeding. ET is markedly thickened and heterogeneous, abundant vascularity with multifocal vessel pattern. Endomyometrial junction is irregular in posterior myometrium, posteriorly. Score of 12 was given, and on histopathology, it was atypical endometrial hyperplasia. Last case, a 55-year-old lady with postmenopausal bleeding, markedly thickened and heterogeneous ET, a minimal streak of anechogenic fluid, moderate multifocal vascularity, and in this we are not able to demarcate the endomyometrial junction, so there is not defined or indistinct endomyometrial junction. Score of 14 was assigned, and it was endometrial cancer on histopathology. So abnormal uterine bleeding is a frequent distressing gynecological complaint. It causes ranges from benign to malignant. So our role as a radiologist is to detect pre-malignant and malignant lesions. So ITA group in 2008 standardized certain terms and definition to describe the ultrasound finding of the abnormal endometrium for improving the diagnosis of endometrial pathologies. So in this study, the average ET was found to be higher in malignant cases. And heterogeneous endometrium was found in endometrial cancers. Only 2 out of 27 cases with homogeneous endometrium had endometrial cancers. So, irregular, interrupted, and undefined endomyometrial junction had diagnostic accuracy of 84.9%. So this is the regular endomyometrial junction, was polyp on histopathology. In this, the endomyometrial junction is indistinct, was endometrial cancer on histopathology. 100% of the cases in this study with interrupted and undefined endomyometrial junction were found to have malignancy on histopathology. And on Doppler, higher scores, more than 3, and multifocal, multiple vessel pattern were associated with malignant lesions. And 2 parameters which were single vessel pattern and presence of midline endometrium are able to safely rule out the malignancy. So we also calculated a ITA score using a scoring method given by Lin et al. So cutoff score of 10 was given in predicting the malignancy with a sensitivity of 82 and specificity of 92%. On the other side, the Lin et al. Gave the cutoff of 6.5. So the difference is because of the differences in the sample size in their study. There was a larger sample size. In our study, the sample size was smaller, and there was more balanced representation of the cases, which lead to a higher average cutoff value. So TVS is a cost-effective, non-invasive, easily accessible, effective way to stratify benign and malignant endometrial pathology. So these were the features associated with benign pathologies, and these are the features which we already discussed associated with the malignant pathologies. So limitation of the study is smaller sample size, single center study, and lesser representation of non-endometrioid endometrial cancer cases. So conclusion is using the ITA parameters and combining them with the scoring system enhances the diagnostic accuracy and our ability to differentiate between benign and malignant endometrial pathology, and reduces the need for unnecessary invasive procedures and advanced imaging, especially in the resource limited areas. These were my references. Thank you.
It's open to questions.
Any
questions?
From the floor? So did you arrive at any safe cutoff for the endometrial thickness in your study?
Ma'am,
Below
thickness,
which you can be surely sure that there is no endometrial CA?
ma'am, in postmenopausal patients, the thickness of 10 was established according to our study, but not in premenopausal because there are more benign cases also, almost equal representation. So the average ET was,
How many were postmenopausal in your study?
ma'am, around 50% of cases were postmenopausal.
Okay. At which cutoff will you advise endometrial biopsy?
Ma'am, histopathology was done for all the cases because we have to correlate with the, in our study, we did the histopathology in every case.
You described apart from endometrial quantitative testing, you have certain qualitative markers like the echogenicity, midline, endomyometrial junction, and the color score.
Yes, ma'am.
Of these qualitative indices, which was the most useful for you to differentiate between benign and malignant?
Ma'am, appearance of endomyometrial junction and presence of vascular pattern, whether the multifocal vessel pattern is present, and endomyometrial junction, whether it is regular or ill-defined or interrupted, that has the maximum diagnostic accuracy.
Did you have any PRF value so that all your color scores are standardized? Or
Ma'am, we did the color, we put scale at 4.5 in all patients.
okay. As a general, like what ISWAG says is less than 5 millimeter,
Yes,
the negative predictive value for CA endometrium is very high. Like even if it is less than 4 millimeter, can you have CA endometrium? So in that case, what will be your ultrasound points to say that you have to go and
Ma'am,
investigate further this case?
Ma'am, other parameters will see whether the thickened ET is homogeneous or non-uniform, whether the vascularity is there, whether there is fluid or not in the endometrial cavity, and whether the endomyometrial junction is maintained or not. These all parameters will consider and then
Yeah,
go.
even though if it is less than 5 also, you have to look at the echogenicity. If it is heterogeneous or if you have some non-uniform echoes, then you have to go and investigate further.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
So you said you did vascular mapping, right?
Yes,
So did you use microvascular imaging or it was a routine Doppler and routine color flow?
Ma'am, routine Doppler imaging.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? With that, we should give her a big applause because she is the winner. It's the end of the day. Come on. Yes.
We request our chairpersons to honor the presenter by giving her the medal. We thank our chairpersons for the